Chapter 1. The Servant's Shame. "You smell like death and beast filth, Kira. Even the rats avoid you now." The words sliced through the morning air like a blade finding flesh. Kira felt them settle into her chest, joining the collection of cruel truths that had carved out a permanent home there. She kept scrubbing the stone floor of the arena stalls, her shoulders hunched against the laughter that followed. The voice belonged to Marcus, Beta Seraphina's cousin, and he stood in the doorway with 3 other pack members, all of them clean and well-fed and certain of their place in the world. They had come to watch her work, the way children might watch ants struggle beneath a magnifying glass. "Look at her," one of them whispered, loud enough for Kira to hear every word. 22 years old, and she still lives in the servant quarters with the kitchen maids. "My grandmother says she's cursed, that's why no wolf will claim her." Kira's hands tightened on the scrub brush, but she said nothing. She had learned long ago that speaking only made it worse. Words were weapons in the hands of pack members like these, and she had no armour against them except silence and the ability to disappear into her work until they grew bored and moved on. The stall she was cleaning belonged to Fenris, a massive black bear shifter who had been brought in yesterday for the arena games. He was one of the dangerous ones, the creatures that fought in the blood matches that entertained the pack during feast days. Most servants refused to enter his enclosure, but Kira had volunteered. She always volunteered for the work others feared. "The choosing ceremony is tomorrow," Marcus continued, leaning against the doorframe. "Beta Seraphina will finally be selected as the ancient guardian's protector. About time the old beast chose someone worthy." At the mention of the ceremony, Kira's hands stilled for just a moment. The ancient guardian. She had heard the stories her entire life, whispered accounts of a creature so old and powerful that it slept for decades at a time, waking only when the magic demanded a new protector. Tomorrow, for the first time in 50 years, it would emerge from the sacred grove to choose. Everyone knew it would choose Beta Seraphina. She was everything the pack valued, beautiful, powerful, born of alpha blood, and blessed with a wolf so magnificent that grown males stepped aside when she shifted. She was perfection wrapped in golden hair and emerald eyes, and she had never looked at Kira as anything more than a stain on the pack's reputation. Can you imagine if the Guardian chose someone like her instead? The speaker gestured toward Kira with disgust. "The shame would destroy us all. Good thing creatures that ancient have sense." More laughter. Kira resumed her scrubbing, focusing on a stain that might have been blood or mud, or something worse. The water in her bucket had turned brown hours ago, but she kept working. Work was the only thing that made the voices fade. Behind her, Fenris stirred in his massive stone cell. The bear shifter had been unconscious when they brought him in, drugged with enough sedative to fell a dozen normal bears, but consciousness was returning. She could hear him breathing, slow and deep, the sound of something wild waking up in captivity. "She doesn't even have a wolf," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a stage whisper. 22 years old and never shifted once. My father says she's not even really pack, just some abandoned thing they took pity on." The brush slipped from Kira's numb fingers and clattered against the stone. She reached for it quickly, but not quickly enough to hide the tremor in her hands. The laughter grew louder. "Look, we broke her," someone said. "Poor little beast keeper can't even hold her cleaning supplies." That had always been enough. That had always been enough to make them cruel, and then bored, and then gone. But as Kira bent to retrieve the brush, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Fenris was awake. The bear shifter's breathing had changed, becoming lighter, more alert. She could feel his eyes on her, studying her movements with predatory intelligence. In his shifted form, he weighed nearly 800 pounds and could tear through iron bars if sufficiently motivated. The druids who had designed his cell swore it could hold him, but Kira had learned not to trust the certainty of others. She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Fenris was sitting upright in his cell, his massive head tilted as he watched her. His eyes were dark amber, almost golden, and they held an intelligence that was distinctly human. When their gazes met, he made a sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a whine. "The beast likes you," Marcus said, his voice suddenly sharp with something that might have been fear. "That's unnatural. Dangerous creatures shouldn't respond to servants." Kira said nothing, but she couldn't look away from Fenris. There was something in his eyes that she recognized, something that called to the empty space inside her chest where other people kept their wolves. Loneliness, maybe, or recognition. The bear shifter moved toward the front of his cell, his massive paws silent on the stone floor. When he reached the iron bars, he pressed his enormous muzzle against them and made that sound again, softer this time. It sounded almost like greeting. Without thinking, Kira stepped closer. She could hear Marcus and his friends shifting nervously behind her, their casual cruelty replaced by genuine unease, but she ignored them. Fenris was watching her with those golden eyes, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt seen. She reached out slowly, her hand trembling, and touched one massive claw that poked through the bars. Fenris went completely still. His breathing stopped, and then he pressed forward into her touch with a gentleness that seemed impossible from something so large and dangerous. "That's not possible," Marcus whispered. "He nearly killed 3 guards when they brought him in. Beasts like that don't gentle for anyone, especially not for—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Kira heard the words anyway. Especially not for nothing. Especially not for no one. Especially not for her. But Fenris had gentled. The massive bear shifter was leaning into her touch like a house cat seeking warmth, his eyes half closed with something that looked like contentment. When she started to pull her hand away, he made a sound of protest that was almost heartbreaking in its longing. "Kira?" The voice cut through the air like a whip crack, and everyone in the stall area froze. Beta Seraphina stood in the doorway, her golden hair gleaming even in the dim light of the underground chambers. She was dressed in ceremonial robes, white and gold silk that made her look like something from a fairy tale, and her emerald eyes were cold with displeasure. "Yes, Beta," Kira said, snatching her hand back from Fenris's cage and dropping into the submissive crouch that had been beaten into her bones. "The ceremony preparations require additional servants," Seraphina said, her gaze flicking dismissively over Kira's stained clothes and work-rough hands. "You'll report to the kitchens immediately. Someone more suitable will finish the beast tending." Translation. Seraphina didn't want Kira anywhere near the ceremony tomorrow. The ancient guardian's choosing was meant to be perfect, a moment of triumph for the pack's golden daughter, and servants like Kira were stains that needed to be scrubbed away before the important moments began. "Yes, Beta," Kira repeated, climbing to her feet. Behind her, Fenris made that sound again, the almost whine that seemed to be calling her back, but she didn't turn around. She had learned not to acknowledge the creatures that responded to her touch. It made the pack uncomfortable, and uncomfortable pack members found reasons to make her life even smaller than it already was. As she gathered her cleaning supplies, Seraphina's voice followed her. "The ceremony begins at dawn," she said, her tone making it clear that this was not information Kira needed, but rather a reminder of everything she would never be part of. 50 years the ancient guardian has slept, waiting for someone worthy enough to serve as its protector. Tomorrow it wakes to choose the future of our pack." Kira nodded and kept walking, her bucket sloshing dirty water with each step. Behind her, Marcus and his friends were murmuring congratulations to Seraphina, their voices bright with anticipation for tomorrow's ceremony. In his cell, Fenris was calling for her with sounds that grew more desperate as she moved away, but she forced herself not to look back. She had spent her whole life being told she was nothing, being treated as less than, being reminded that her place was in the shadows where important people wouldn't have to see her. Tomorrow, when the ancient guardian emerged from its sacred grove, it would look upon the assembled pack and choose its protector from among the worthy. It would choose Seraphina, beautiful and powerful and born to greatness. It would not choose the beastkeeper who slept in the servants' quarters and scrubbed blood from arena stones. That had always been enough truth to carry her through another day of invisibility. But as Kira climbed the stone steps toward the kitchens, she could still hear Fenris calling for her, his voice growing fainter but never stopping. And for reasons she couldn't name, the sound made something deep in her chest begin to ache with an impossible hope she had no right to feel. Chapter 10. The New Order. 6 months had passed since the shadow magic was banished from the northern kingdoms, and the Silver Moon Palace had been transformed from a battlefield into the thriving heart of a new political order. Kira stood on the balcony of her private chambers, watching the morning sun paint the courtyard below in shades of gold and silver, and marvelled at how much had changed since that terrifying night when ancient prophecy had demanded everything she had to give. The courtyard that had once echoed with the sounds of battle now bustled with the organised activity of a kingdom that had found its rhythm. Pack representatives from territories that had once questioned her legitimacy now moved through the palace halls with the easy confidence of allies who had witnessed her power firsthand. The shadow creature attack had been visible throughout the region, impossible to dismiss as political theatre or magical trickery. When a queen could banish nightmare creatures that conventional weapons couldn't touch, territorial disputes seemed suddenly petty by comparison. Through the mate bond that connected her to Theron like silver fire made permanent, she felt his approach before she heard his footsteps on the marble floors. He had been in the council chamber since dawn, working with territorial leaders to establish new trade agreements and mutual defence pacts. The political landscape that had seemed so fractured during her early days as queen had stabilised into something that might actually last. The Crimson Ridge delegation finally signed the Northern Territories Compact, he said, moving to stand beside her at the balcony's edge. His presence was warm and solid against her shoulder, a comfort that had only grown stronger as they learned to wield their combined power. Elder Gareth admitted that questioning our bond was short-sighted, given the results we've achieved together. Kira leaned into his embrace, feeling the deep satisfaction that flowed through their connection. The mate bond had proven itself far beyond romantic attachment or political alliance. It was a partnership that had reshaped how the Northern Kingdoms understood the relationship between personal connection and effective leadership. "Any word from the southeastern territories?" she asked, though she could sense the answer in his emotional state through their bond. "The last 3 holdout packs have agreed to formal recognition," Theron replied, his voice carrying quiet triumph. "As of this morning, every territory in the Northern Kingdoms acknowledges the Silver Moon Throne and our joint authority. The Regional Council will be fully unified for the first time in over a century." Below in the courtyard, the ancient guardian padded across the stones with its characteristic grace, leading a group of young pack members in their morning training. The great creature had taken on the role of teacher and mentor, passing on knowledge of the old ways to a generation that would grow up understanding the connection between civilized pack life and the wild magic that pulsed at the heart of all things. The sight filled Kira with deep contentment. This was what she had been born for, not just to rule, but to serve as the bridge between worlds that her ancestors had served before her. The palace had become a place where pack politics and ancient magic coexisted in harmony, where young wolves learned to respect both hierarchy and the creatures that had no use for human social structures. "The Eastern delegation wants to discuss expanding the creature protection treaties," Theron continued, his arm tightening around her waist as he shared her satisfaction through their bond. 3 more territories have reported increased cooperation between their border guards and wild creature populations. Whatever you did to strengthen the connections between the bloodlines is spreading beyond just our immediate region. The phenomenon had been growing for months, ever since the prophecy fulfillment had sent ripples of renewed magic throughout the supernatural community. Pack members who had never shown particular sensitivity to creature communication were discovering they could sense the emotional states of wild animals. Border conflicts between territories and migrating creature populations had decreased dramatically as both sides found new ways to coexist. It was exactly what the Silver Moon bloodline had been created to achieve, but seeing it happen felt like witnessing a miracle unfold in real time. "There's something else," Theron said, and through their bond she felt the spike of anticipation and joy that made her heart race before he spoke the words aloud. "Healer Moira confirmed it this morning. You're with child." The world seemed to stop, every sensation crystallizing into perfect clarity as the truth settled into her consciousness. A child, their child, carrying both bloodlines, born into a world where the ancient covenants had been renewed and the balance between civilization and wild magic had been restored. Through the mate bond, she felt Theron's fierce protectiveness and overwhelming love surge in response to her wonder and joy. But underneath those emotions, she sensed something deeper, his awe at the thought that their bond would create new life, a child who would inherit powers that could reshape the world itself. "The prophecies speak of a new generation," she said, her voice soft with reverence as she placed her hand over her still flat stomach. "Children who will be born knowing what we had to learn through trial and struggle, who will grow up understanding that power and responsibility are inseparable." The ancient guardian's massive head turned toward their balcony, and through their connection she felt its approval and protective joy. The great creature had sensed the new life immediately, its supernatural awareness recognizing the significance of a child who would carry both Silver Moon and Alpha King bloodlines. "The kingdom is stable," Theron said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had spent months ensuring that truth. "The territories are unified, the ancient protections are renewed, the trade agreements will ensure prosperity for generations. Our child will be born into a world at peace." But even as Kira felt the deep contentment that came with successful completion of their destined purpose, even as she marvelled at the life growing within her, a part of her mind remained alert to the dangers that would always threaten those who wielded power. Seraphina and her remaining allies had fled the region after the shadow magic failed, but they had not been captured or eliminated. Somewhere beyond the borders of the unified territories, enemies who had spent decades believing themselves safe from Silver Moon vengeance were undoubtedly planning new approaches to the problem she represented. "What are you thinking about?" Theron asked, his supernatural awareness of her emotional state making it impossible to hide the shadow of concern that had crossed her mind. "The future," she said honestly, leaning back against his chest as she watched the Guardian continue its patient instruction of the young wolves below. "Our child will inherit incredible power, but also incredible responsibility. There will always be those who see power as something to be taken rather than earned, who view our bloodline as a threat to their ambitions." "Then we teach them what we learned," Theron replied, his arms tightening around her in protective embrace. "That power shared is stronger than power hoarded, that leadership is service, not dominance, that the bonds we choose are more important than the hierarchies we inherit." Through the mate bond, she felt his absolute commitment to protecting their growing family and the kingdom they had built together. But she also felt his confidence that they had created something strong enough to survive the challenges that would inevitably come. "The Pack Councils are already discussing the implications," he continued, his voice carrying a hint of amusement at the political manoeuvring that had begun the moment news of her pregnancy started to spread. "Half of them want to declare a year-long celebration. The other half are trying to establish formal protocols for a royal heir who will inherit both Silver Moon magic and Alpha King authority." Kira laughed, the sound carrying across the courtyard and making the Guardian look up with what she could have sworn was approval. The political complications of their child's inheritance would be significant, but they were also proof that the Northern Kingdoms had truly accepted the new order they had created. "Let them plan their protocols," she said, placing her free hand over Theron's where it rested against her stomach. "Our child will make their own choices about how to use their inheritance. All we can do is teach them to choose wisely." Through the ancient guardian's eyes, she caught a glimpse of the future that stretched ahead of them. Years of peace and prosperity, of a kingdom where pack politics and wild magic coexisted in harmony. Children who would grow up taking for granted the cooperation between species that their parents had fought to establish. A world where the Silver Moon bloodline could fulfill its destined purpose without the constant threat of those who would see it destroyed. She had spent her whole life being told she was nobody, being treated as less than, being reminded that her place was in the shadows where important people wouldn't have to see her. But she was Queen Lyrily of the Silver Moon, mate to the Alpha King, guardian of the ancient covenants, and soon to be mother to a child who would inherit the power to reshape the world. And finally, for the first time since her awakening began, she felt like she had found her true place in the world, not in the shadows, but in the light that would guide future generations toward a destiny none of them could yet imagine. Chapter 11. The Next Generation. The birth came with the first snow of winter, as though the ancient powers themselves had chosen to mark the arrival of a child who would bridge two worlds with her very existence. Kira held her daughter against her chest, marvelling at the perfect tiny fingers and the silver hair that already gleamed with its own inner light, and felt the ancient guardian's deep contentment through their bond, as the great creature sensed the completion of prophecy written in bloodlines older than memory. "She's magnificent," Theron whispered, his voice rough with emotion, as he traced one gentle finger along their daughter's cheek. Through the mate bond, Kira felt his overwhelming love and fierce protectiveness, but also his wonder at the power that already flickered beneath the infant's pale skin like captured starlight. They had named her Selene after the first Silver Moon Queen, but even in her first hours of life, it was clear that she would forge her own path through the world. Her eyes, when they opened, were neither the golden fire of Kira's bloodline nor the dark authority of Theron's lineage, but something entirely new. Silver shot through with depths that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. "Look," Kira breathed, shifting the baby so Theron could see what had captured her attention. Selene's tiny fist had closed around the pendant that hung at Kira's throat, the ancient silver responding to the infant's touch with gentle warmth. But it was what happened next that made both parents catch their breath in wonder. Every creature within the palace walls, from the ancient guardian in the courtyard to the smallest songbird in the gardens, fell silent simultaneously, as though acknowledging the presence of something they had been waiting centuries to witness. Through the window, Kira could see wild animals emerging from the forest to gather at the palace's borders, not in threat or alarm, but in recognition. Bears that should have been deep in winter hibernation stood vigil in the snow. Wolves from territories hundreds of miles away had travelled to be present for this moment. Even creatures of legend, phoenixes whose feathers blazed despite the falling snow, unicorns whose breath steamed silver in the cold air, had come to witness the birth of a child who carried the hopes of both civilized pack and wild magic in her blood. "She's calling to them," Theron said, his voice filled with awe as he watched their daughter's peaceful face. Not consciously, not with intent, but her very existence is like a beacon that every creature with supernatural awareness can sense. The ancient guardian's massive form appeared at the chamber's doorway, its golden eyes fixed on the infant with protective devotion that transcended species. When it spoke through their mental connection, its voice carried joy older than the mountains themselves. "The bloodlines are unified, little queen. The prophecy reaches its true fulfillment. Your daughter will know no division between pack politics and creature wisdom, no separation between the magic of civilization and the magic of the wild places." As if responding to the guardian's words, Selena made her first sound. Not the cry that might be expected from a newborn, but something that was part human baby's coo and part wolf pup's contented whine. The sound carried clearly through the palace, and every creature that heard it responded with their own voices of welcome and recognition. Her first words won't be Mama or Papa, Kira said, laughing through tears of joy and wonder. They'll be in the language that speaks to every living thing. Over the following days, as news of the royal birth spread throughout the northern kingdoms, it became clear that Selene's arrival had triggered changes that would reshape the supernatural landscape for generations to come. Pack members who had never shown particular sensitivity to creature communication found themselves understanding the emotional states of wild animals with startling clarity. Children throughout the territories began displaying abilities that their parents had never possessed: telepathic connections with family pets, instinctive knowledge of which plants were safe to eat, an ability to calm aggressive animals with nothing more than gentle words. "The barriers are dissolving," Elder Miriam explained during one of her daily visits to the royal nursery. The ancient woman had appointed herself unofficial advisor on the supernatural implications of Selene's birth, and her weathered face glowed with satisfaction every time she observed the infant's development. "Your daughter's existence is proof that the old divisions between human and creature consciousness were artificial constructs. She's showing the world what unity actually looks like." Selene's development exceeded every expectation, supernatural and mundane alike. By her first month, she could make herself understood to any creature within the palace walls. By her second month, she was demonstrating the ability to project calm emotions that could soothe even the most aggressive beasts. And by her third month, when most infants were just beginning to focus their eyes properly, Selene was having complex conversations with the ancient guardian in a mixture of telepathic communication and soft baby sounds that somehow carried meaning clearer than human speech. "She's going to be extraordinary," Theron said one evening, as they watched their daughter sleeping peacefully in her cradle, surrounded by small creatures who had appointed themselves her unofficial guardians. A fox curled against one side of the cradle, a raven perched on the headboard, and a pair of silver-furred wolf pups, gifts from the northern territories, dozed at the foot of the bed. "She already is," Kira replied, reaching out to stroke Selene's silver hair. The infant stirred at her touch, opening those incredible eyes that seemed to hold starlight, and smiled with recognition that sent warmth cascading through the mate bond that connected all three of them now. Through the ancient guardian's memories, Kira caught glimpses of what the future might hold. Selene growing into a young woman who moved effortlessly between palace councils and wild creature gatherings, translating needs and concerns that had gone unheard for centuries. A generation of children growing up in a world where cooperation between species was so natural they couldn't imagine any other way of living. Kingdoms where the health of wild territories was considered as important as trade agreements, where the voices of ancient creatures carried weight in political decisions. But even as she marvelled at the peaceful world Selene's existence was helping to create, Kira couldn't entirely set aside the protective instincts that came with royal blood. Power like their daughter possessed would always draw attention, some of it benevolent and some of it dangerous. "There will be those who fear her," she said quietly, voicing the concern that had been growing in her heart since the moment of Selene's birth. "Those who see her abilities as a threat to the established order, who prefer the old divisions because they made control easier." "Then we'll do what we've always done," Theron replied, his arm tightening around her shoulders as they watched their daughter sleep. "We'll protect her while teaching her to protect herself. We'll show her how to use power responsibly while never apologizing for the strength she carries." Through the mate bond, Kira felt his absolute commitment to their growing family and the kingdom they had built around the principle that connection was stronger than domination. But she also felt his quiet confidence that Selene would face her challenges from a position of strength their generation had never known. "She'll never have to wonder if she belongs," Kira said, and the words carried all the weight of her own transformation from invisible servant to acknowledged queen. "She'll never doubt her worth or question whether she deserves the power that flows through her bloodlines. That alone makes her stronger than we ever were at her age." As if responding to her mother's words, Selene made that sound again. the hybrid of human baby and wolf pup that seemed to speak directly to the heart of every living thing that heard it. The creatures surrounding her cradle stirred gently, their contentment adding to the peaceful atmosphere that had settled over the royal chambers. Outside the windows, snow continued to fall over a kingdom that had found its balance between civilization and wild magic, between the hierarchies that made organized society possible and the ancient connections that reminded everyone where true power originated. Kira had spent her whole life being told she was nobody, being treated as less than, being reminded that her place was in the shadows where important people wouldn't have to see her. But her daughter would grow up knowing she was somebody extraordinary, somebody who carried the hopes of two worlds in her blood, somebody who would never have to choose between belonging to civilized society and honouring the wild magic that made all life possible. And that transformation, more than any political victory or supernatural triumph, felt like the true fulfillment of everything Kira had fought to achieve. Chapter 12. Eternal bond years had transformed the Silver Moon Palace from a seat of political power into something that felt more like home than Kira had ever thought possible. She stood in the same spot where she had once scrubbed blood from arena stones, but now the space had been converted into a training ground where young pack members learned to communicate with the wild creatures that served as willing partners rather than conquered subjects. Her daughter Celine, now 5 years old and radiating the confident grace of someone who had never doubted her place in the world, moved through the practice exercises with fluid ease. Her silver hair caught the afternoon light as she worked with a young dire wolf, their communication flowing seamlessly between telepathic connection and gentle-spoken words that somehow carried meaning in multiple species' languages simultaneously. "She's everything we hoped she would be," Theron said, moving to stand beside Kira as they watched their daughter demonstrate abilities that would have been considered miraculous when they were her age. His presence was warm and familiar after years of shared rule and deeper intimacy, the mate bond between them having evolved from desperate recognition into something that felt as natural and necessary as breathing. "She's more," Kira replied, her voice soft with maternal pride and wonder. "She's proof that the barriers we thought were permanent were just temporary obstacles waiting for someone brave enough to dissolve them." Through the ancient guardian's eyes, she could see the broader transformation that Celine's generation represented. Throughout the northern kingdoms, children were growing up with abilities their parents had never imagined possible. Pack councils routinely consulted with wild creature representatives. Border disputes had become virtually extinct as both human and animal populations learned to communicate their needs directly rather than fighting over misunderstood intentions. The world Celine was inheriting was fundamentally different from the one Kira had been born into, shaped by choices that had prioritized connection over control, cooperation over domination. "Do you ever regret it?" Theron asked, though she could feel through their bond that he already knew her answer. "The path we chose, the prices we paid to get here?" Kira looked around the training ground, taking in the sight of pack children working alongside creature partners with the easy familiarity of those who had never known artificial divisions between species. In the distance, she could see the palace gardens where Elder Miriam continued her research into the old bloodline connections, surrounded by assistants who treated ancient magical knowledge as naturally as others might study mathematics or literature. "Never," she said, and the word carried all the certainty of someone who had finally found her true purpose in the world. Every struggle, every moment of doubt, every battle we fought, it all led to this, to her, to the world she'll inherit. The ancient guardian padded over to join them, its massive presence as familiar and comforting as family after years of shared purpose. When it spoke through their mental connection, its voice carried deep satisfaction and the profound peace of duty fulfilled. "The bloodline is secure, little queen. The prophecies have reached their completion. Your daughter will face her own challenges, but she faces them from strength you never knew at her age." Through the palace windows, Kira could see representatives from distant territories arriving for the evening's council session. The northern kingdoms had never been more stable, their prosperity built on the foundation of cooperation between all the species that shared the land. Trade agreements now included provisions for creature migration routes. Defense pacts acknowledged that wild animal populations were early warning systems for supernatural threats. The kind of shadow magic that had once nearly destroyed them all was now impossible to hide from the combined awareness of human and creature intelligence networks. The delegation from the Eastern Seas wants to establish formal diplomatic relations, Theron said, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of a ruler who had helped build something worth preserving. They've heard about our creature alliance protocols and want to adapt similar systems for their maritime territories. Another kingdom learning that connection is stronger than conquest, Kira observed, feeling the deep contentment that came with witnessing the spread of principles they had fought so hard to establish. As the sun began to set over the palace grounds, painting the sky in shades of gold and silver that seemed to echo the colours of her bloodline's power, Celine finished her training session and ran toward them with the boundless energy of a child who had never known fear or doubt about her place in the world. "Mamma, Papa, watch this!" she called, her voice carrying the musical quality that made every creature within hearing distance turn toward her with automatic attention and affection. She held out her small hand toward a group of ravens perched on a nearby fence, and they immediately took flight, forming complex patterns in the air that spelled out words in a script older than human writing. The message they created was simple but profound. Love unites all. "Did you teach them that?" Theron asked, his voice filled with the wonder that their daughter could still inspire, even after years of witnessing her extraordinary abilities. "The ravens taught me," Celine replied, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone for whom such communication was perfectly normal. "They said it was something the ancient guardian told them long ago, when it was first learning to bridge the worlds." Through their connection, Kira felt the guardian's amused approval. The great creature had indeed shared that wisdom, but seeing it expressed through the perfect innocence of a child who had never doubted the truth of it carried special meaning. "Come here, little star," Kira said, opening her arms to embrace her daughter. Celine melted into the hug with the complete trust of a child who had never been given reason to doubt her parents' love or protection. "Will you tell me the story again?" Celine asked, settling against Kira's side with the expectation of having her request granted. "About how you and Papa met, and how the guardian chose you, and how you learned you were a queen." It was a story Celine had heard dozens of times, but one that never seemed to lose its appeal. Kira suspected that part of the fascination came from her daughter's inability to truly imagine a world where someone could grow up believing themselves worthless. In Celine's experience, every creature had inherent value that was recognized and celebrated by those around them. "Once upon a time," Kira began, her voice carrying the cadence of a tale that had become family legend, "there was a girl who believed she was nobody special because that's what the world had taught her to believe about herself." As she told the familiar story of recognition and awakening, of ancient guardians and impossible choices, of love that grew stronger under pressure and power that was meant to be shared rather than hoarded, Kira felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had not just survived their trials, but transformed them into wisdom worth passing on. The girl who had scrubbed floors and believed herself worthless had become a queen who commanded the respect of kingdoms and the loyalty of legends. But more than that, she had become a mother who was raising a daughter who would never have to learn her own worth through struggle and suffering. "And they lived happily ever after?" Celine asked, even though she knew the ending by heart. "They lived meaningfully ever after," Kira corrected gently, the way she always did. "Happiness comes and goes, little star, but meaning, knowing who you are and why you matter, that lasts forever." Through the mate bond, She felt Theron's deep agreement and the love that had only grown stronger through years of shared purpose. They had built something together that would outlast their individual lives, a legacy written not just in bloodlines and political structures, but in the transformed world their choices had created. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, as the palace settled into the peaceful rhythms of evening, Kira held her daughter close and felt the profound contentment of someone who had finally found their place in the world. She had spent her whole life being told she was nobody, being treated as less than, being reminded that her place was in the shadows where important people wouldn't have to see her. But she was Queen Lyrily of the Silver Moon, mate to the Alpha King, mother to a daughter who would reshape the world, guardian of ancient covenants that would protect future generations from the darkness that sought to divide and conquer. She was somebody who mattered, somebody who had changed the world through the simple but revolutionary act of refusing to believe that love was weakness or that connection was vulnerability. And that truth would echo through generations yet to come, carried in the bloodlines of children who would never doubt their worth because their parents had fought to ensure they would inherit a world that celebrated strength shared rather than power hoarded. The bond between her and Theron pulsed with silver fire, eternal and unbreakable, a testament to the truth that some connections were strong enough to reshape the world itself. Chapter 2. The Ancient Awakening. Dawn broke over the sacred grove with cruel efficiency, painting the ceremonial grounds in shades of gold and blood. Kira stood at the very back of the assembled pack, pressed against the rough bark of an ancient oak where the shadows were deepest and her presence might go unnoticed. She had not slept. The kitchens had kept her working through the night, preparing ceremonial foods she would never be allowed to taste, and her hands still smelled of rosemary and lamb fat. The entire pack had gathered in the circular clearing that surrounded the sacred grove, their bodies arranged in perfect hierarchy, like ripples spreading outward from a stone dropped in still water. At the centre, on a raised platform draped in white silk, Beta Seraphina knelt in formal supplication. She looked like a goddess carved from moonlight and dreams, her golden hair braided with silver threads that caught the early morning sun, her ceremonial gown flowing around her like liquid starlight. Around the platform, the elders sat in carved wooden chairs, their faces solemn with the weight of witnessing something that happened once in a generation. Beyond them, the high-ranking pack members stood in precise formations, their wolves close enough to the surface that the air shimmered with barely contained power, and beyond them, pressed against the tree line like unwanted shadows, stood the servants and the lowborn and the forgotten. Kira had never seen so many pack members in one place. There had to be nearly 1,000 wolves gathered in the clearing, all of them focused on the dark opening in the grove where the ancient guardian had slept for 50 years. The silence was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat, rapid and nervous against her ribs. Then the ground began to tremble. It started as barely a whisper of movement, so subtle that Kira thought she might be imagining it. But the trembling grew stronger, rhythmic, like the footsteps of something impossibly large moving through the earth itself. The pack members looked at each other with expressions of awe and fear, and Beta Seraphina lifted her chin with serene confidence. The ancient guardian was waking. Kira felt something stir deep in her chest, something that had nothing to do with her racing heart or her nervous breathing. It was a pull, gentle but insistent, like a golden thread being drawn taut between her ribs and the darkness of the sacred grove. She pressed her hand to her chest, confused by the sensation, but the pulling only grew stronger. A sound emerged from the grove that was unlike anything Kira had ever heard. It was not a roar or a howl or a growl, but something older than words, deeper than language. It resonated in her bones and made her wolfless heart skip with recognition she couldn't explain. Then it emerged. The ancient guardian stepped from the shadows of the grove like a myth taking flesh, and the assembled pack drew a collective breath that sounded like wind through winter branches. It was massive, easily 3 times the size of the largest wolf Kira had ever seen. But it was not a wolf, not entirely. Its fur was silver that seemed to hold moonlight, so bright it was almost painful to look at directly. Its eyes were pools of liquid gold that held intelligence older than the pack's recorded history. When it moved, power rippled through the air around it like heat waves rising from summer stone, and every wolf in the clearing felt their beasts respond with instinctive submission. The guardian paused at the edge of the grove, its ancient gaze sweeping across the assembled pack with the weight of judgment. When its eyes passed over Kira, hidden in her distant shadows, that golden thread in her chest pulled so hard it nearly brought her to her knees. Beta Seraphina rose gracefully from her kneeling position, her movements flowing like water as she spread her arms in welcome. Her voice, when she spoke, carried across the clearing with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. "Ancient guardian," she said, her words ringing with ceremonial formality, "I offer myself as your protector and servant. Choose me, and I will guard your sacred duty with my life and my power." The guardian looked at her for a long moment, its golden eyes unreadable. The pack held its breath. This was the moment they had all come to witness, the inevitable choosing that would cement Seraphina's place in pack legend. The guardian turned away. A murmur rippled through the crowd, confusion and disbelief threading through voices that had been certain of what they would see. Seraphina's perfect composure cracked for just an instant, her emerald eyes flashing with something that might have been panic, but she recovered quickly. "Perhaps the ceremony requires all candidates to present themselves," Elder Magnus said from his carved chair, his voice carefully neutral. "Guardian, will you consider other offerings?" Several high-ranking females stepped forward, their wolves powerful and their bloodlines pure. One by one, they offered themselves to the ancient guardian with words of devotion and promises of service. One by one, the creature looked at them with those ancient golden eyes and found them wanting. With each rejection, the murmur of the crowd grew louder. This wasn't how the stories went. The guardian was supposed to choose immediately, to recognize worthiness when it saw it. But instead, it stood motionless in the center of the clearing, its massive head turning slowly as it searched for something the pack couldn't understand. Then its gaze found Kira. The golden thread in her chest went taut as a bowstring, and suddenly she couldn't breathe. The guardian was looking directly at her across the vast space of the clearing, through the hundreds of pack members between them, and its eyes held a recognition that made her soul ache with impossible longing. It began to walk toward her. The crowd parted like water before the massive creature, pack members stumbling over each other in their haste to get out of its path. Wolves who had stood proud and confident moments before now pressed themselves low to the ground in instinctive submission as the guardian moved past them without a glance. Kira tried to step backward, to disappear deeper into the shadows where she belonged, but her body wouldn't obey. The golden thread had become a chain, holding her in place while the most powerful creature she had ever seen approached with deliberate earth-shaking steps. "This isn't possible," someone whispered, and the whisper was picked up and passed through the crowd like wildfire. "It's walking toward the servants. It's walking toward the Nothing-born." The guardian reached the edge of the crowd where Kira stood frozen against her oak tree. Up close, it was even more magnificent and terrible than she had imagined. Its silver fur seemed to move with its own light, and its golden eyes held depths that spoke of centuries beyond counting. When it looked down at her, she felt as though it was seeing not just her face, but her soul, examining every secret she had ever buried and finding them all acceptable. Slowly, carefully, the ancient guardian lowered its massive head until its muzzle was level with her chest. The golden thread that had been pulling her toward it suddenly snapped into place with an almost audible click, and she felt something settle into her heart that had been missing her entire life. The Guardian pressed its nose gently against her hand. The silence that followed was so complete that Kira could hear the wind moving through individual leaves in the canopy above. 1,000 wolves stood frozen in disbelief, their certainty shattered by the impossible sight of the ancient Guardian choosing the one person in the pack who had never mattered. Then the creature did something that would be spoken of in whispers for generations to come. It sat, the ancient Guardian, older than memory and more powerful than legend, settled itself at Kira's feet like a house cat seeking attention. Its enormous head rested against her legs with a gentleness that seemed impossible from something so vast, and it made a sound deep in its chest that was unmistakably contentment. Mate. The word came from nowhere and everywhere, a voice that resonated through the clearing with the force of absolute truth. The ancient Guardian recognizes its chosen protector, but that wasn't right. The voice hadn't come from the Guardian. Kira turned toward the sound, her movements dreamlike in the surreal moment, and saw him. Alpha King Theron stood at the edge of the clearing, and he was looking directly at her. He was everything the stories claimed and more, tall enough to tower over the largest wolves in the pack, broad enough to fill doorways, with dark hair and eyes that held the weight of absolute authority. Power radiated from him in waves that made the air itself seem to bend, and when he moved it was with the fluid grace of a predator who had never known defeat. But it was his eyes that stopped Kira's heart. They were fixed on her with an intensity that burned, and in them she saw the same recognition that had passed between her and the Guardian. Something impossible, something that could not be. "The Guardian has chosen," Alpha King Theron said, his voice carrying across the clearing with quiet authority. "And so have I." The golden thread in Kira's chest exploded into a web of fire and light that connected her to both the creature at her feet and the male striding toward her through the stunned crowd. She felt their recognition of her settle into her bones like truth finally being spoken aloud. But that was impossible. She was nobody. She was nothing. She was the beast keeper who slept in the servants' quarters and scrubbed blood from stones. She was not someone who got chosen by legends. The ancient Guardian made that contented sound again and pressed closer to her legs, its warmth seeping through her rough servant's dress. Alpha King Theron continued his approach, each step deliberate and sure, his eyes never leaving her face. And somewhere in the crowd, Beta Seraphina stood forgotten on her ceremonial platform, her perfect world cracking apart like ice in spring thaw. Everything changed when the ancient Guardian chose her over all of them. But as Kira stood there with legend at her feet and impossible recognition burning in the Alpha King's eyes, she realized that everything changing might be the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to her. She had spent her whole life being nobody. She had no idea how to be somebody the ancient Guardian would choose. Chapter 3. Impossible Recognition. The silence stretched like a held breath until Elder Magnus found his voice, though it came out strangled and uncertain. "There must be some mistake," he said, rising from his carved chair with movements that betrayed his age. "The Guardian is confused by the scent of the beasts she tends. Perhaps if we cleanse the area and begin the ceremony again." "There is no mistake." Alpha King Theron's voice cut through the elder's words like a blade through silk, carrying authority that brooked no argument. He had stopped walking, but remained focused on Kira with an intensity that made her skin burn. "The ancient Guardian recognizes what it chooses to recognize, as do I." The crowd erupted in whispers that rose and fell like waves against stone. Pack members turned to each other with expressions of confusion and disbelief, their voices creating a buzz that filled the sacred clearing with doubt and speculation. But she's nobody, someone said, the words carrying clearly in the morning air. She doesn't even have a wolf. How can something so ancient and powerful choose someone so empty? The ancient guardian lifted its massive head from where it rested against Kira's legs and turned toward the speaker with eyes that held the weight of glaciers. The whispers died immediately, cut off by the sudden awareness that questioning the guardian's choice might not be wise, while the creature was still present and clearly protective of its selection. Beta Seraphina stepped down from her ceremonial platform with movements that retained their grace despite the tremor in her hands. Her emerald eyes were bright with unshed tears of rage and humiliation, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "Alpha King Theron," she said, offering him a formal bow that managed to convey both respect and wounded pride. "Surely you cannot mean to honour this aberration. The guardian is clearly ill, or under some enchantment. No creature of such wisdom would choose a servant over those of us born to greatness." Kira flinched at the word aberration, feeling it settle into the collection of wounds she carried in her chest. But the ancient guardian made a sound deep in its throat that was unmistakably a warning, and the golden thread connecting her to the creature pulsed with protective warmth. "Are you questioning my judgment, Beta Seraphina?" Theron asked, his tone deceptively mild. "Because that would suggest you believe yourself wiser than both an ancient guardian and your Alpha King." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, wrapped in courtly language that couldn't hide the steel beneath. Seraphina's face went pale, but she lifted her chin with the stubborn pride that had never served her poorly before. "I question nothing, Alpha King," she said carefully, "but perhaps a test would reassure the pack that the Guardian's choice is genuine. If this girl truly has some connection to ancient power, surely she can demonstrate it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Pack members nodded to each other, grasping at the suggestion like drowning swimmers reaching for driftwood. A test would make sense of the impossible. A test would either reveal hidden greatness or expose the Guardian's choice as the mistake it had to be. Theron's dark eyes moved from Seraphina to Kira, studying her with an attention that made her want to disappear into the shadows that had always been her refuge. When he spoke, it was directly to her, as though the 1,000 other wolves in the clearing had ceased to exist. "Can you speak to it?" he asked, his voice gentler than it had been with the others, but still carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Can you communicate with the Guardian as legends say its protectors once could?" Kira opened her mouth to say no, to explain that she was exactly what they all thought she was. Nobody, nothing, a mistake that needed to be corrected. But the ancient Guardian shifted beside her, pressing its massive shoulder against her hip, and suddenly she could feel something flowing between them that had nothing to do with words. Images flashed through her mind that were not her own. Ancient forests where creatures like the Guardian ran free, their power unbound by human politics or pack hierarchies. A silver-haired woman who commanded respect from wolves and wild beasts alike. Her presence so regal that mountains themselves seemed to bow in her honour, and underneath it all, a sense of recognition so profound it made her soul ache with longing. She began, her voice barely a whisper. "I can feel it. Its thoughts, its memories." The crowd pressed closer, their disbelief warring with fascination as they witnessed something that had not been seen in living memory. Even the elders leaned forward in their chairs, their ancient faces creased with wonder and fear. "What does it remember?" Theron asked, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like hope. Kira closed her eyes and let herself sink into the connection, feeling the Guardian's consciousness wrap around hers like warm honey. The images came faster now, clearer, carrying with them emotional truths that resonated in her bones. "It remembers the Silver Moon Pack," she said, her voice growing stronger as the memories flowed through her. A bloodline that could speak to ancient creatures, that served as bridges between wild magic and civilized wolves. It remembers a queen who wore moonlight in her hair and commanded the loyalty of every beast in the northern forests. A gasp went up from the elders, and Elder Magnus stumbled backward as though he had been struck. His weathered face went white as winter snow, and his hands shook as he gripped the arms of his chair. "The Silver Moon Pack was destroyed," he whispered, his voice thick with shock and what might have been fear. 23 years ago, during the Great War. They were all killed, every last one of them. The Guardian made a sound that was neither growl nor whine, but something older, something that spoke of loss and grief and terrible longing. Through their connection, Kira felt the creature's pain as though it were her own, and she understood with sudden, blazing clarity why it had slept for 50 years. It had been waiting, mourning, hoping against hope that one day someone would emerge who carried the bloodline it had served for millennia. "All but one," Theron said quietly, his voice carrying a certainty that made the air itself seem to hold its breath. "The Guardian recognizes what remains." He was looking at Kira again, and in his dark eyes she saw a knowledge that terrified her more than all the Pack's cruelty ever had. He knew something about her that she didn't know about herself, something that would change everything if it were true. "That's impossible," Seraphina said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "She's a servant, a nobody. She doesn't even have a wolf." "Doesn't she?" Theron asked, and he began walking toward Kira again, each step deliberate and certain. "Guardian, will you vouch for her bloodline? Will you confirm what my instincts already know?" The ancient Guardian rose to its feet, towering over even Theron's impressive height, and lifted its muzzle toward the sky. The sound it made was unlike anything that had come before, a howl that carried harmonics of power older than the Pack's recorded history, older than the treaties and hierarchies that governed their world. Every wolf in the clearing felt their beasts respond to that call. Alphas who had never bowed to anyone found themselves dropping to one knee. Betas pressed themselves low to the ground in instinctive submission. Even the servants and the lowborn felt something stir in the empty spaces where their wolves should have been. But Kira felt something else entirely. The howl reached inside her and found something that had been sleeping, something that had been deliberately buried so deep she had never known it existed. It unfurled like a flower blooming in fast forward, stretching toward the Guardian's call with desperate recognition. Her wolf. She had a wolf. The realization hit her like lightning, illuminating corners of herself that had been dark her entire life. She could feel it now, the presence that had always been there, but somehow hidden, somehow suppressed by forces she didn't understand. It was silver bright and fierce and ancient, carrying power that made the very air around her shimmer with contained energy. "There she is," Theron said, his voice soft with wonder and something that might have been relief. He had reached her now, standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body and smell the wild, dangerous scent that clung to his skin. "There's the wolf that's been waiting to wake up." The Pack had gone silent again, but this time the silence carried weight instead of emptiness. They were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be retold in whispers and legends for generations to come. The servant girl who had never mattered was standing in the centre of their sacred ceremony with an ancient guardian at her feet and an alpha king at her side, and her wolf was finally stirring to life. But even as Kira marvelled at the presence, she could feel uncurling in her chest, even as she tried to process the impossible truth that she carried Silver Moon blood. A new fear began to take shape in her mind. If what they were saying was true, if she really was the last heir of a bloodline that had been deliberately destroyed, then someone had worked very hard to hide her identity. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure she grew up believing herself to be nothing, nobody, unworthy of notice. Which meant someone had a reason for wanting the Silver Moon bloodline to remain buried. And if they learned that she had awakened, that the Guardian had chosen her, and her wolf was finally stirring to life, they might decide to finish what they had started 23 years ago. The golden thread that connected her to the Guardian pulsed with protective warmth, and she felt another thread, silver bright and impossibly strong, reaching toward Theron. But even as those connections filled the empty spaces in her heart, she couldn't shake the feeling that her awakening had just painted a target on her back. She had spent her whole life being nobody, invisible and safe in her insignificance. Now she was somebody the ancient Guardian would choose, somebody the Alpha King would recognize, somebody who carried the blood of queens in her veins, and somebody, somewhere, was going to be very unhappy about that. Chapter 4. Hidden Bloodline Whispers. The hours that followed the ceremony were a blur of chaos and whispered conversations that died whenever Kira drew near. She had been moved from the servants' quarters to a guest chamber in the main compound, a room with actual windows and furniture that didn't smell of mildew and despair. The ancient Guardian had refused to leave her side, its massive form curled around her doorway like a living barrier that no one dared cross. Kira sat on the edge of a real bed for the first time in her life, her hands trembling as she tried to process everything that had happened. Her wolf was still there, stirring restlessly beneath her skin like a caged bird testing its wings. She could feel its presence more clearly now, silver bright and fierce, carrying power that made her fingertips tingle with contained energy. But power was dangerous when you didn't understand it, and Kira understood nothing. A soft knock at the door made her jump, her heart hammering against her ribs. The Guardian lifted its massive head, golden eyes alert, but it made no move to stop whoever was approaching. Through their connection, she felt the creature's assessment. No threat, familiar scent, old pack member with memories that went deep. "Come in," Kira called, her voice barely above a whisper. The door opened to reveal Elder Miriam, the oldest of the pack's female advisors, and the only elder who had ever shown Kira anything approaching kindness. She was ancient even by pack standards, her hair white as winter snow and her face creased with lines that spoke of nearly a century of accumulated wisdom. In her gnarled hands she carried a wooden box that looked as old as she was. "Child," Miriam said softly, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. The Guardian watched her approach, but made no sound of warning, apparently sensing the same lack of threat that Kira felt. "We need to speak of things that have been buried too long." Kira rose from the bed, uncertain how to behave around an elder, now that her circumstances had changed so dramatically. But Miriam waved away her attempt at formal courtesy, settling herself into the room's single chair with movements that spoke of arthritis and old bones. "Sit, girl," she said, gesturing toward the bed. "What I have to tell you will be easier to bear if you're not swaying on your feet with shock." The wooden box in Miriam's lap seemed to pulse with its own energy, drawing Kira's attention like a lodestone pulling iron. Her newly awakened wolf pressed closer to the surface, responding to something about the object that made her skin prickle with recognition. "You remember me, don't you?" Miriam asked, her faded blue eyes studying Kira's face with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "From when you were very small, I used to visit the servants' quarters sometimes, bring you little cakes from the kitchens when the cooks weren't looking." Kira did remember, though the memories were hazy and dreamlike. A kind old woman who would appear sometimes when the loneliness was too much to bear, who would sit beside her narrow cot and tell her stories of brave wolves and ancient magic. She had thought they were just fairy tales. "I remember," Kira said carefully. "You were kind to me when others weren't." "I was watching over you," Miriam corrected, her voice heavy with regret and old sorrow. "As much as I dared, anyway. There were those who would have seen you dead if they knew what you truly were, and I was old even then, with little power to protect you from determined enemies." The Guardian made a soft sound in its throat, something that might have been agreement or approval. Through their connection, Kira felt the creature's memories stirring again, images of the old woman visiting a silver-haired queen, bringing reports and counsel in times of great need. "What am I?" Kira asked, though part of her already knew the answer would change everything. Elder Magnus said the Silver Moon Pack was destroyed, everyone killed, but if I carry their blood—" "You are Lyra Lee Silvermoon," Miriam said quietly, her words falling like stones into still water. "Daughter of Queen Celeste and King Aldrich, heir to the most powerful bloodline our people have ever known. And yes, your family was destroyed, murdered in their beds by those who feared what they represented." The name hit Kira like a physical blow, resonating in her bones with a truth she couldn't deny. Her wolf sang in response to it, recognizing its own identity with fierce joy. But the human part of her mind reeled from the impossibility of it all. "That's not possible," she whispered. "I'm a servant. I was found abandoned. I don't have their power, their grace, their—" "You have all of it," Miriam interrupted, lifting the wooden box from her lap and holding it out toward Kira. "Hidden, suppressed, buried so deep that even you forgot who you were. But the ancient guardian remembers, and now that it has chosen you, the barriers that kept you hidden are beginning to crack." Kira stared at the box, afraid to touch it, but unable to look away. It was carved from wood so dark it was almost black, inlaid with silver patterns that seemed to shift and move in the lamplight. Her wolf was practically vibrating with excitement, pressing against her consciousness with urgent need. "What's in there?" she asked. "Proof," Miriam said simply, "and power. Your mother's pendant, the one she wore on the night she died. It was made from silver mined in the sacred mountains, blessed by creatures older than recorded history. It will only respond to silver moon blood." With trembling hands, Kira reached for the box. The moment her fingers touched the carved wood, it sprang open as though it had been waiting centuries for her touch. Inside, nestled on a bed of midnight blue velvet, lay a pendant that made her breath catch in her throat. It was a crescent moon carved from silver, so pure it seemed to hold its own light, suspended on a chain that looked like captured starlight. Ancient runes covered its surface, their meanings hidden but somehow familiar, as though she had seen them in dreams she couldn't quite remember. "Go on," Miriam urged gently. "Take it. It belongs to you by right of blood and birth." Kira lifted the pendant from its resting place, and the moment the silver touched her skin, the world exploded into light and memory and truth. She saw her mother, Queen Celeste, standing in a moonlit garden with silver hair that flowed like liquid starlight and eyes that held the wisdom of ages. She saw her father, King Aldrich, tall and strong and fierce, with wolves and wild creatures alike bowing before his gentle authority. She saw herself as an infant, wrapped in silk the colour of moonlight, while ancient beasts stood guard over her cradle. And she saw the night they died. Fire and blood and screaming filled her vision as enemy wolves poured through the palace like a plague, cutting down everyone in their path. She saw her mother hiding a baby, herself in a servant's basket, while death approached their sanctuary. Felt her father's final act of magic, casting a spell so powerful it would hide his daughter's true nature even from herself, ensuring that she would survive even if they did not. The visions ended as abruptly as they had begun, leaving Kira gasping on the floor beside the bed. The guardian was beside her immediately, its massive head pressing against her shoulder in comfort and support, while Miriam's weathered hands helped her sit up. "Easy, child," the old woman said softly. "The memories always come hard the first time. Your parents loved you enough to sacrifice everything to keep you alive, including your knowledge of who you were." Kira looked down at the pendant in her hands, and it was glowing now, silver light pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. Her wolf was fully awake, no longer hidden or suppressed, and she could feel power flowing through her veins like liquid fire. "Why now?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the intensity of the visions. "Why is this happening now, after 23 years?" "Because the ancient guardian woke," Miriam said, settling back into her chair with obvious relief. "Its power called to yours, cracking the barriers your father placed around your mind and soul. And because the time for hiding is over, There are those who have grown comfortable believing the Silver Moon bloodline was extinct. They will not be pleased to learn they were wrong. As if summoned by her words, a sound echoed through the compound that made Kira's blood run cold. The Guardian's head snapped up, its lips pulling back from fangs the size of daggers, and a growl rumbled in its chest that spoke of ancient fury barely held in check. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. "They know," Miriam whispered, her face going pale as winter snow. "Someone has been watching, listening. They know you've awakened." The pendant in Kira's hands pulsed brighter, responding to the danger that approached with silver fire that seemed to burn without heat. Through the window she could see shapes moving in the darkness beyond the compound walls, too many to count, and moving with the coordination of a planned attack. The Guardian rose to its feet with fluid grace, positioning itself between Kira and the door, and she felt its readiness to fight through their bond like a physical sensation. But even as powerful as the creature was, she could sense its uncertainty. It had been sleeping for 50 years. It didn't know how many enemies they faced or what weapons they might bring to bear. "What do I do?" Kira asked, looking between Miriam's worried face and the Guardian's protective stance. "I don't know how to fight. I don't know how to use whatever power this pendant holds." "You learn quickly," Miriam said, rising from her chair with more speed than her age should have allowed. "Because, child, I'm afraid you're about to get a very intensive education in exactly what it means to be the last heir of the Silver Moon bloodline." The sounds outside were getting closer now, the coordinated movement of trained fighters closing in on their position. The Guardian's growl deepened, and through their bond, Kira felt its primitive satisfaction at the prospect of protecting its chosen queen. She had spent her whole life being told she was nobody, being treated as less than, being reminded that her place was in the shadows where important people wouldn't have to see her. But she was Lyralee Silvermoon, daughter of queens, heir to power that could command the loyalty of ancient beasts and wild magic alike. And tonight, for the first time in her life, she was going to find out exactly what that meant. Chapter 5. The Silver Bloodline. The attack came with the subtlety of falling shadows and the violence of winter storms. Kira heard the first scream from somewhere deep in the compound, a sound of terror and pain that cut through the night air like a blade. The ancient Guardian's massive form went rigid beside her, its golden eyes blazing with fury that had been building for 50 years of forced sleep. Through their bond, she felt its primitive satisfaction at finally having enemies to face. "They've breached the outer walls," Miriam said, her ancient voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "Seraphina's faction. They must have been planning this since the ceremony ended." The pendant around Kira's neck pulsed with silver fire, responding to her fear and confusion with power that made the air itself shimmer around her. She could feel something vast and ancient stirring in her blood, connections forming between herself and every living creature within miles of the compound. It was overwhelming and terrifying and magnificent all at once. "I don't know how to fight," Kira said, her voice breaking on the admission. "I don't know how to use any of this." "Your bloodline knows," Miriam replied, moving toward the window with surprising speed for someone her age. "Trust your instincts, child. Trust what your wolf is telling you." Her wolf. The silver-bright presence that had been hidden for 23 years was fully awake now, pressing against her consciousness with urgent need. It wanted to shift, to take its true form and show the world what it meant to carry the blood of ancient queens. But Kira had never shifted before, had never even felt the possibility until this moment. The door to her chamber exploded inward in a shower of splinters and twisted metal. 3 wolves poured through the opening, their eyes glowing with the feral light of the hunt, their fangs bared in anticipation of an easy kill. They wore the colours of Seraphina's personal guard, elite fighters who had never known defeat. The ancient guardian met them with a roar that shook the foundations of the compound. What followed was not a battle, but a demonstration of why legends existed. The guardian moved with fluid grace that belied its massive size, its claws and fangs finding their targets with surgical precision. The first attacker died before he could even shift to human form. The second managed a single howl of terror before ancient jaws closed around his throat. The third turned to run and found himself face to face with something that had been old when his great-grandmother was young. But even as the guardian protected her with lethal efficiency, Kira could hear more attackers in the corridors beyond. Too many for even a creature of legend to face alone. Through the window she saw fires burning in the compound courtyard and shapes moving with military precision through the smoke. This wasn't a spontaneous attack born of wounded pride. This was an assassination, planned and coordinated and executed with the cold efficiency of those who had done this before. 23 years ago, they had murdered her parents. Tonight, they intended to finish what they had started. The pendant around her neck flared brighter, and suddenly Kira could feel them all. Every wolf in the attacking force, their positions and intentions as clear to her as if she were looking at a map drawn in light. 47 enemies, moving through the compound like a plague, killing anyone who stood between them and their target. But she could feel something else too. Other presences responding to the silver fire that poured from her pendant like a beacon. Wild creatures throughout the forest, ancient beasts that remembered the old alliances, creatures that had served her bloodline when the world was younger, and magic flowed freely between human and animal consciousness. They were coming. "Alpha King Theron approaches," Miriam said from her position at the window, her voice tight with relief. "He felt the bond's distress and comes with his personal guard." Through the mate bond that had snapped into place during the ceremony, Kira could sense Theron's fury like a physical force. He was still distant, but moving toward her with the desperate speed of someone who would tear the world apart to reach his mate. The knowledge that he considered her his mate, that he was coming for her, filled her with strength she hadn't known she possessed. But he was too far away, and the enemies were too close. The guardian finished with the last attacker and turned toward the doorway, where more shapes were moving in the corridor beyond. Its mental voice reached her through their connection, ancient and wise and absolutely certain. "It is time, little queen, time to show them who you truly are." The words resonated in her bones, like truth finally being spoken aloud. Her wolf surged upward, silver-bright and fierce, and for the first time in her life, Kira didn't fight the change that wanted to consume her. The shift hit her like lightning given form. Pain lanced through every bone as they cracked and reformed, as her spine elongated and her face pushed forward into a muzzle. She heard herself scream, but the sound came out as a howl, long and mournful and filled with rage for all the years she had been hidden, all the years she had believed herself to be nothing. But this was not the agonizing transformation she had expected. This was power recognizing its true form, magic that had been suppressed finally breaking free. Silver light poured from her fur as she completed the change, and when she opened her eyes, the world looked different, clearer, more real. Every scent told a story, every sound carried information, every heartbeat in the compound was as familiar to her as her own pulse. She was magnificent. Her wolf form was larger than any normal pack member's, with fur the colour of moonlight on snow and eyes that blazed with silver fire. Ancient power flowed through her like liquid starlight, and she could feel the recognition of every creature within miles. They knew what she was. They knew who she was. The Silver Moon Queen had returned. More attackers poured through the doorway, but they stopped short when they saw her. Fear flickered in their eyes as they recognized something they had thought extinct, something their leaders had assured them was safely buried in the past. Kira spoke, and her voice carried the authority of bloodlines that stretched back to the founding of the packs. "You killed my parents," she said, her words carrying both human speech and wolf communication simultaneously. "You murdered innocents to steal power that was never yours to take, but you missed one." The attackers tried to scatter, their earlier confidence shattered by the impossible sight of a silver moon heir in her full power. But it was too late for retreat. The Guardian moved to block their escape, while wild creatures began pouring through the windows, ravens with eyes like black diamonds, foxes that moved like liquid shadow, bears that had abandoned their winter dens to answer an ancient call. And at their head came Alpha King Theron. He burst through the window in his wolf form, black fur rippling with barely contained power, his eyes blazing with protective fury. When he saw Kira in her transformed state, when he felt the full force of the mate bond connecting them to each other and to powers older than recorded history, he shifted back to human form and spoke words that would be remembered for generations. "You touch my mate, you face the consequences of war." The remaining attackers tried to fight, but they were facing forces they had no hope of defeating. The Ancient Guardian's claws found their targets with lethal precision. Theron moved through them like death-given form, protecting his mate with savage efficiency. And Kira herself, finally understanding what it meant to carry the Silver Moon bloodline, called upon powers that had been sleeping in her blood for 23 years. Silver light poured from her in waves, and every wild creature it touched became hers to command. They moved with perfect coordination, an army of beasts defending their rightful queen against those who had tried to erase her from existence. The battle was over in minutes. When the silence fell, broken only by the sound of crackling fires and distant voices calling for healers, Kira stood in the centre of her destroyed chamber, surrounded by allies who had answered her call. The Guardian pressed against her side with warm approval. Theron watched her with eyes that held wonder and desire and absolute recognition of what she had become. She was no longer the servant who scrubbed floors and tended to dangerous creatures because no one else would do the work. She was Lyrelay Silvermoon, heir to the most powerful bloodline the Pax had ever known, chosen by ancient guardians and claimed by the Alpha King himself. And tonight she had finally learned what that meant. But as Miriam approached through the debris, her weathered face creased with concern, Kira realized that surviving the first assassination attempt was only the beginning. "They'll try again," the old woman said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "Seraphina's faction won't give up simply because they failed once. They've spent 23 years believing themselves safe from Silver Moon vengeance. Now that they know you live, they'll throw everything they have at you." Kira nodded, her wolf form still blazing with silver light that seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. Through the mate bond, she felt Theron's fierce protectiveness and his determination to stand beside her against whatever came next. Through her connection to the Guardian, she felt the deep satisfaction of ancient powers finally awakening to reclaim their rightful place in the world. She had spent her whole life being told she was nobody, being treated as less than, being reminded that her place was in the shadows where important people wouldn't have to see her. But she was the Silver Moon Queen, and the shadows belonged to her now. Chapter 6. Power Unsealed. The dawn that followed the attack broke over a compound transformed by violence and revelation. Kira stood on the balcony of her new chambers, rooms that had once belonged to visiting dignitaries, now hers by right of blood and the ancient guardian's unwavering loyalty. Below in the courtyard, pack members moved with careful deference, their eyes tracking her movements with expressions that held equal parts wonder and fear. She was still in her wolf form, silver fur rippling with contained power that made the morning air shimmer around her like heat waves. The transformation back to human felt strange now, as though her wolf was reluctant to retreat after 23 years of forced hiding. Through the mate bond that pulsed silver bright between them, she could feel Theron's approach before she heard his footsteps on the stone stairs. He emerged onto the balcony, carrying clothes that smelled of cedar and sunshine, his dark eyes studying her transformed state with an intensity that made her heart race. When he spoke, his voice carried the rough edge of someone who had spent the night ensuring no more assassins lurked in the shadows. "The compound is secure," he said, settling the bundle of fabric on a nearby chair. "My personal guard has swept every building, every tunnel, every hiding place large enough to conceal a threat. We found evidence of how they entered. A section of the outer wall that had been weakened from the inside, probably over the course of weeks." Kira shifted back to human form, the change flowing through her like water finding its natural course. Silver light played across her skin as the transformation completed, and she felt Theron's sharp intake of breath as he witnessed the magic that now moved freely through her bloodline. When she stood before him in human form, everything about her had changed. Silver streaks ran through her dark hair like captured moonbeams, and her eyes blazed with the golden fire of ancient power. Marks had appeared along her arms and shoulders during the night, intricate silver patterns that looked like a combination of runic script and flowing vines, evidence of magic that had been awakening in her blood since the Guardian's choosing. "I can feel them," she said, accepting the clothes from him with hands that still tingled with residual power. "Everyone in the compound, their heartbeats, their emotions, their intentions. It's overwhelming." Theron stepped closer, his presence warm and steady against the chaos of sensations threatening to drown her. When he reached out to trace one of the silver marks on her shoulder, his touch sent sparks of recognition through the mate bond that connected them. "Your abilities are expanding faster than anyone expected," he said, his voice low with concern and admiration. "Elder Miriam says it's because you were suppressed for so long. Now that the barriers are broken, everything is emerging at once." As if summoned by his words, voices rose from the courtyard below. Kira moved to the balcony's edge and saw a crowd gathering around the central fountain, their faces turned upward toward her with expressions that ranged from awe to barely concealed terror. At the crowd's centre stood Seraphina, her golden beauty unmarred by the previous night's violence, her emerald eyes blazing with fury and wounded pride. "She's a pretender," Seraphina's voice carried clearly in the morning air, pitched to reach every ear in the courtyard. A servant girl playing at royalty, using dark magic to deceive the ancient guardian and seduce our Alpha King. The real Silver Moon bloodline died 23 years ago, and we all know it. Murmurs of agreement rippled through sections of the crowd, pack members who had grown comfortable with the current hierarchy, who saw Kira's emergence as a threat to their established positions. But other voices rose in counterpoint, wolves who had witnessed the previous night's battle and recognized the authenticity of power that could not be faked. "I saw her command the wild creatures," someone called out. "Ravens and foxes and bears that came to her call. That's not dark magic, that's the old bloodline gift." "The ancient guardian bowed to her," another voice added. "Creatures that ancient don't make mistakes about bloodline recognition." Kira felt the mate bond pulse as Theron moved to stand beside her at the balcony's edge. His presence radiated the controlled authority of someone accustomed to command, but she could sense his careful restraint. This was her moment to claim, her authority to establish. He would support her, but the pack needed to see her stand on her own power. "Answer them," he said quietly, his voice meant for her ears alone. "Show them what it means to carry the Silver Moon name." Drawing on instincts she was only beginning to understand, Kira let her power flow outward like silver light made visible. The air around her began to glow with the same luminescence that had filled the pendant, and every creature within miles felt the pull of ancient authority awakening. When she spoke, her voice carried not just to the courtyard below, but to every corner of the compound, enhanced by magic that had been sleeping in her bloodline for generations. "I am Liralee Silvermoon," she said, and the words rang with truth that resonated in the bones of every wolf who heard them. "Daughter of Queen Celeste, heir to powers that predate your petty politics and territorial squabbles, I did not ask for your recognition, and I do not require your permission to claim what is mine by right of birth and blood." The silver marks on her arms and shoulders began to glow brighter, and the wild creatures that had answered her call the night before emerged from hiding places throughout the compound. Ravens perched on rooftops with eyes like black diamonds. Foxes padded between the legs of startled pack members. Bears that should have been deep in winter hibernation stood at the compound's edges like silent sentinels. And through it all, the ancient guardian remained at her side, its massive presence a living testament to the legitimacy of her claim. "You want proof of my bloodline?" Kira continued, letting her power flow through every word. "You want evidence that I am who I claim to be?" She raised her hand, and every wild creature in the compound responded simultaneously. Birds took flight in perfect formation, their wings creating patterns against the morning sky. Ground creatures moved in synchronized waves, demonstrating coordination that spoke of supernatural command. Even the insects in the gardens responded to her call, their movements creating subtle rhythms that matched her heartbeat. But it was what happened next that silenced even Seraphina's protests. The ancient guardian lifted its massive head toward the sky and howled, a sound that carried harmonics older than recorded history. And from the forest beyond the compound, other voices answered. Creatures that had not been seen in the civilized territories for decades emerged from their hidden sanctuaries, drawn by a call they had been waiting 50 years to hear. Dire wolves with eyes like molten gold padded out of the tree line. Ancient stags with antlers that seemed to hold their own, inner light, stepped delicately across the frost-covered ground. Even creatures of legend, phoenixes whose feathers blazed with actual fire, dragons no larger than house cats but radiating power that made the air itself shimmer, came to witness the return of their rightful queen. The courtyard fell silent as the assembled pack absorbed the impossible sight of legendary creatures paying homage to someone they had dismissed as a servant girl only days before. "The wild magic recognizes me," Kira said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had finally found her true self. "The ancient creatures know what you refuse to see. I am not a pretender or an imposter. I am the last heir of a bloodline that commanded respect when your ancestors were still learning to shift." Seraphina tried one last time to rally opposition, her voice sharp with desperate defiance. "She uses forbidden magic to control these creatures, dark arts that corrupt the natural order. We cannot allow—" Her words were cut off as every wild creature in the compound turned their attention toward her simultaneously. Hundreds of pairs of eyes, gold and silver and diamond bright, focused on the woman who dared question their queen's authority. The message was unmistakable. They were here by choice, not compulsion. They served love, not fear. Elder Magnus stepped forward from the crowd, his ancient face creased with wonder and what might have been relief. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of formal recognition. "The bloodline test's true," he said, his words falling like stones into still water. "The creatures confirm what the ancient guardian declared. Lady Liralee Silvermoon is acknowledged as the legitimate heir to the Silvermoon throne." A ripple of formal bows spread through the courtyard as pack members absorbed the implications of the elder's declaration. Some bent willingly, recognizing power that demanded respect. Others bowed reluctantly, political necessity overriding personal preference. But all of them bowed. All except Seraphina, who stood rigid with fury and wounded pride, her emerald eyes promising that this was far from over. Through the mate bond, Kira felt Theron's fierce satisfaction and protective pride. He stepped closer, his presence warm against her back, and when he spoke, it was with the authority of an Alpha King, claiming his chosen mate before witnesses. "The Silver Moon Queen has returned," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the compound. "And I claim her as mine, as she claims me. Let any who would challenge this bond face the consequences of opposing both ancient bloodlines and the creatures who serve them." The formal claiming sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. This wasn't just political alliance or strategic marriage. This was the Alpha King publicly acknowledging a mate bond that connected him to powers older than the pack hierarchies themselves. Kira felt the truth of it settle into her bones like recognition finally being spoken aloud. She was no longer the servant who had spent her life believing she was nothing. She was the Silver Moon Queen, chosen by ancient guardians, claimed by the Alpha King, and recognized by wild creatures who had waited generations for her return. But as the crowd began to disperse, carrying word of the morning's revelations to every corner of the territory, she couldn't shake the feeling that Seraphina's silence was more dangerous than all her protests had been. The real war was just beginning, and now that her power was fully unsealed, now that her true identity blazed like silver fire for all the world to see, the enemies who had murdered her parents would have no choice but to try again. Only this time they would be facing not a helpless infant, but a queen who commanded the loyalty of legends. Chapter 7. The Beast Queen Rises. The formal declaration ceremony took place 3 days after the public claiming, in the ancient amphitheatre that had witnessed the coronations of pack royalty for over 1,000 years. Carved from living stone and open to the sky, the amphitheatre seemed to pulse with its own power as representatives from every territory in the northern kingdoms gathered to witness something that had not happened in their lifetimes: the return of a silver moon heir to her rightful throne. Kira stood at the centre of the ceremonial circle, wearing robes of midnight blue silk embroidered with silver threads that seemed to move with their own inner light. The ancient guardian sat at her right side, its massive presence a living reminder of the bloodline's legitimacy. At her left, Alpha King Theron waited in formal regalia, his dark eyes holding fierce pride as he prepared to witness his mate claim her birthright. But it was the creatures gathered around the amphitheatre's edges that truly marked this as a ceremony unlike any other in recorded history. They had come from every corner of the wild territories, drawn by the awakening of power they had thought lost forever. Dire wolves with coats like liquid shadow sat alongside their smaller cousins. Ancient bears that had slept through decades of political upheaval stood witness with eyes that held the wisdom of centuries. Ravens and hawks and eagles formed a living canopy overhead, their wings casting patterns of light and shadow across the assembled crowd. And beyond them, in the deeper shadows where legend met reality, other shapes waited. Creatures so old and powerful that most pack members had believed them to be myths. Phoenixes whose feathers blazed with actual fire, unicorns whose horns caught and refracted light into rainbow cascades, dragons whose scales gleamed like precious metals in the afternoon sun. "Citizens of the northern kingdoms," Elder Magnus intoned, his ancient voice carrying clearly through the stone amphitheatre, "we gather today to witness the formal recognition of Lady Liralee Silvermoon, rightful heir to the throne that has stood empty for 23 years. A murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd. Representatives from dozens of territories had travelled here to see this moment, their faces reflecting everything from wonder to calculated political interest. Some had come out of genuine respect for the Silver Moon legacy. Others had come to assess whether this new queen would be ally or obstacle to their own ambitions. But all of them had come because they recognised that power of this magnitude could not be ignored. Do you accept the responsibilities of the Silver Moon throne? Magnus asked, turning toward Kira with the formal solemnity the moment demanded. Do you swear to protect the ancient alliances, to guard the balance between civilized pack and wild magic, to serve as bridge between human and beast consciousness for as long as you draw breath? Kira felt the weight of the words settle into her bones, like truth finally being spoken aloud. Through her connection to the Guardian, she could sense the approval of every creature present. Through the mate bond, she felt Theron's unwavering support. But it was her own wolf, silver-bright and fierce, that gave her the strength to speak the words that would change everything. "I accept," she said, her voice carrying across the amphitheatre with the power that had been sleeping in her bloodline for generations. "I swear by blood and bond, by silver light and ancient oath, to serve as the bridge between worlds that my ancestors served before me." The ancient guardian rose to its feet and placed its massive paw on an ornate cushion that held the crown of the Silver Moon Queens. The circlet was wrought from silver so pure it seemed to hold its own light, inlaid with moonstones that pulsed in rhythm with the wearer's heartbeat. It had been crafted by the first Silver Moon Queen over a millennium ago, blessed by creatures older than recorded history. As Magnus lifted the crown from its resting place, every wild creature in the amphitheatre fell silent. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the restoration of a bloodline that had commanded their loyalty since the first packs learned to shift between human and wolf form. By the authority of the ancient guardian, by the witness of the wild creatures, by the recognition of the assembled territories, Magnus said, holding the crown above Kira's head. "I name you Queen Liralee of the Silver Moon, rightful ruler of the northern wilds, keeper of the ancient covenants." The crown settled onto her brow, with a sensation like lightning given form. Power flowed through the connection, linking her not just to the Guardian, but to every creature that had ever served her bloodline. She could feel their recognition, their joy, their fierce protectiveness flowing through bonds older than civilization itself. And then the creatures began to sing. It started with the Guardian, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated in the very stones of the amphitheatre. The dire wolves joined their voices to the ancient song, followed by the bears and the great cats, and the birds of prey overhead. Even the legendary creatures added their voices, the phoenixes with notes like liquid fire, the unicorns with sounds like crystal bells, the dragons with deep bass tones that made the ground tremble. The song they sang was older than language, older than the first human settlements, older than the first pack hierarchies. It was the song of recognition, the melody that acknowledged the return of a bloodline that had been mourned as lost forever. Pack members throughout the amphitheatre felt their wolves respond to that ancient music, felt something stir in their blood that connected them to powers they had forgotten existed. Some wept openly at the beauty of it. Others stood transfixed, witnessing something they would remember for the rest of their lives. But it was Alpha King Theron who provided the moment that would be spoken of in legends for generations to come. As the song reached its crescendo, as the power flowing through Kira blazed bright enough to be visible even in daylight, he stepped forward and knelt before her throne. The Alpha King, who bowed to no one, who had commanded respect and fear from every territory in the known world, knelt before his mate and spoke words that would reshape the political landscape of the northern kingdoms. "I pledge my strength to your throne, my sword to your service, my heart to your keeping," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent amphitheatre. "I am yours as you are mine, bound by ties that neither politics nor time can sever." The formal pledge sent shockwaves through the assembled representatives. This wasn't just personal devotion. This was the Alpha King subordinating his authority to hers, creating a new hierarchy that elevated the Silver Moon throne above even his own considerable power. Kira reached down to touch his bowed head, feeling the mate bond between them pulse with silver fire. When she spoke, her words carried the authority of ancient queens and the warmth of a woman who had finally found her place in the world. "Rise, my king," she said, and the title carried weight beyond mere courtesy. "We rule together, as it was meant to be." As Theron rose to stand beside her throne, the crowd erupted in cheers that echoed off the stone walls like thunder. Representatives who had come to assess her strength now scrambled to offer their own pledges of loyalty. The sight of the Alpha King kneeling had convinced even the most sceptical observers that this new queen commanded power worth respecting, but not everyone in the amphitheatre was cheering. In the shadows at the edge of the gathering, Seraphina watched with emerald eyes that blazed with fury and wounded pride. She had been forced to attend the ceremony, political necessity demanded it, but her presence radiated hostility that made the air around her feel cold and dangerous. Through her enhanced senses, Kira could feel Seraphina's rage like a physical presence, along with something else that made her blood run cold: fear. Not the healthy respect that power should inspire, but the desperate terror of someone whose deepest secrets were about to be exposed. The Guardian's mental voice reached her through their bond, carrying warnings that had been building since the ceremony began. She is not alone in her plotting, little queen. Others share her fear, others who profited from your family's destruction. The celebration draws them into the open, but it also makes them desperate. As if responding to the Guardian's warning, Kira felt a disturbance at the edge of her expanded senses. Movement in the shadows beyond the amphitheatre, coordinated and purposeful. Too many hearts beating with the rhythm of battle preparation, too many minds focused on objectives that had nothing to do with celebration. "Something's wrong," she said quietly, her voice meant only for Theron's ears. "There are others, armed, organised, moving into position." Theron's expression didn't change, but she felt his alertness spike through their bond. Years of combat experience had taught him to trust his mate's instincts, especially when those instincts were enhanced by supernatural awareness. How many, he asked, his voice carrying no further than her ears, despite the crowd's cheering. 30, maybe 40, she replied, letting her senses spread outward like a net. They're surrounding the amphitheatre, professional fighters, not pack members, mercenaries maybe, or... Her blood went cold as recognition hit her. The scent signatures she was detecting, the coordination of their movements, the quality of their equipment. She had encountered it all before, in the memories the Guardian had shared with her. These were the same forces that had destroyed her family 23 years ago. "We need to evacuate the civilians," she said, rising from her throne with fluid grace that belied the urgency building in her chest. "Now, before they complete their encirclement." But even as she spoke, she knew it was too late. The attackers had planned this moment carefully, had waited until the ceremony drew every important figure in the northern kingdoms into one place. They weren't here for a simple assassination. They were here for a massacre that would eliminate every potential ally she might have, every leader who might support her claim, every witness to her legitimate rule. The ancient Guardian was on its feet, its lips pulling back from fangs the size of daggers as it sensed the approaching threat. Around the amphitheatre's edges, the wild creatures that had come to witness her coronation began shifting into defensive positions, their celebration transforming into protective fury. Kira raised her hand, and her voice carried across the amphitheatre with supernatural force. "Citizens of the northern kingdoms," she said, her words cutting through the cheering like a blade through silk. "We are under attack. Guards, protect the civilians. Representatives, shield your delegations. This is not a request." The crowd's celebration died instantly, replaced by the efficient movement of trained fighters responding to royal command. But even as pack warriors moved to defensive positions, even as the legendary creatures prepared for battle, Kira knew that this fight would be different from the assassination attempt 3 nights ago. This time, the enemy had come prepared for war, and this time she would have to prove that being the Silver Moon Queen meant more than wearing a crown and commanding the loyalty of ancient beasts. She would have to show the world what it truly meant to be born to power that could reshape the balance between civilization and the wild magic that pulsed at the heart of all things. The real test of her reign was about to begin. Chapter 8. The Mate Bond's Price. The days that followed the thwarted coronation attack were heavy with the weight of political necessity and personal longing that pulled in opposite directions. Kira stood in the war room of the Silver Moon Palace. Her palace now, a truth that still felt strange on her tongue, surrounded by maps and reports that painted a grim picture of the forces arrayed against her. 17 territories have formally recognised your claim, Elder Magnus said, his weathered finger tracing lines across the territorial map. But 12 remain uncommitted, and 3 have openly declared their support for the old ways. They question whether a queen who was raised as a servant can truly understand the complexities of rule. Through the mate bond that connected her to Theron like a silver thread wound through her very soul, Kira felt his frustration spike. He had been in meetings since dawn with his own advisers, men who had served his bloodline for generations and who now found themselves questioning whether their Kingsmate bond was worth the political chaos it had created. "The Crimson Ridge Pack has sent a formal petition," Theron said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger as he entered the war room. His dark eyes found hers across the space, and she felt his exhaustion through their connection like a physical ache. "They demand that I reconsider the mate bond in favour of a political alliance with the Eastern Territories. They claim the stability of the kingdom depends on it." The words hit Kira like a physical blow, even though she had been expecting them. Political marriages were the foundation of pack alliances, and her emergence had disrupted carefully laid plans that stretched back decades. The logical choice would be for Theron to set aside their bond in favour of an arrangement that could bring peace to the fractured territories. But the mate bond wasn't logical. It was deeper than politics, stronger than strategy, more fundamental than the hierarchies that governed pack life. To sever it would be like tearing out half of their souls. "What did you tell them?" she asked, though she could feel the answer in the fierce protectiveness that flowed through their connection. "I told them they could petition me from the bottom of the northern lakes," Theron replied, his voice carrying the cold authority that had made him the most feared Alpha King in living memory. "The mate bond is not a political convenience to be negotiated. It's a sacred connection recognised by forces older than their petty territorial disputes." Elder Magnus cleared his throat, his expression carefully neutral as he addressed the elephant in the room that everyone was trying to ignore. "Alpha King, with all due respect, the stability of the Northern Kingdoms has always depended on strategic alliances. If the other territories believe that your personal attachments compromise your judgment, they may choose to settle their disputes through other means." War. He meant war, though he was too diplomatic to say the word directly. If the territories couldn't trust Theron to make decisions based on kingdom welfare rather than mate bond obligations, they would handle their conflicts themselves, possibly through violence that could tear the entire region apart. Kira felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a cloak made of lead. Every choice she made, every step she took toward claiming her rightful power, seemed to create new problems for the man she loved. The servant girl who had scrubbed floors and tended beasts had never had to consider the political ramifications of her existence. But the Silver Moon Queen's every breath had consequences that rippled through the lives of thousands. "Perhaps," she said carefully, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart, "it would be better if we stepped back from the public bond. If the political situation requires—" "No." Theron's voice cut through her words like a blade through silk, carrying absolute authority that brooked no argument. "I will not pretend that what we share is anything less than destiny itself. The territories can adapt to our bond, or they can face the consequences of opposing it." Through the window, Kira could see the ancient guardian pacing the palace courtyard with restless energy. The great creature had been agitated since the coronation attack, its supernatural senses detecting threats that mortal awareness couldn't perceive. Wild creatures throughout the territory were responding to its unease, gathering in the forests beyond the palace walls like an army preparing for war. "The Guardian senses something," she said, letting her consciousness expand to touch the minds of the creatures that served her bloodline. "There's another attack coming, larger than before, better coordinated. They're not just trying to eliminate me anymore, they're planning something that will destabilize the entire region." Magnus and Theron exchanged looks that spoke of military experience and political calculation. If the enemies who had murdered her parents were escalating to regional warfare, then every territory in the northern kingdoms was at risk regardless of their position on Kyra's legitimacy. "How long do we have?" Theron asked, his hand moving instinctively to the sword at his side. Kyra closed her eyes and let her awareness flow outward through the network of connections that linked her to every wild creature for hundreds of miles. What she sensed made her blood run cold with recognition and fear. "They're already moving," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 separate forces approaching from different directions, professional soldiers, not pack warriors. They're planning to hit multiple targets simultaneously: the palace, the territorial capitals, the sacred groves where the ancient creatures gather. "A coordinated strike to eliminate the leadership and destroy the spiritual centers that legitimize your claim," Magnus said, his ancient face going pale as he grasped the implications. "If they succeed, the northern kingdoms will descend into chaos. Every territory fighting for survival, no central authority to maintain peace." The mate bond pulsed between Kyra and Theron as they absorbed the magnitude of the threat they faced. This wasn't just about their personal bond anymore. It was about whether the careful balance of power that had maintained peace for generations would survive the return of the Silver Moon bloodline. "We need to warn the other territories," Kyra said, moving toward the communication crystals that connected the palace to distant capitals. "Whatever their position on my claim, they don't deserve to be slaughtered by mercenaries hired by those who profit from chaos." "And risk revealing our intelligence sources?" Magnus asked. "If we tell them how we know about the attacks, we expose the extent of your supernatural awareness. That information could be used against us." Theron stepped closer to Kyra, his presence warm and steady against the cold calculations of political necessity. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who had made an irrevocable choice. "We tell them," he said simply. "We warn every territory, help them prepare defences, do everything in our power to minimize the bloodshed, because that's what leaders do. They protect their people, even when those people question their authority." The decision sent warmth through the mate bond, a recognition that despite the political pressure and strategic complications, Theron's moral compass remained true. He would not sacrifice innocent lives for political advantage, would not let others die to protect their secrets. But as Kyra began activating the communication crystals, sending urgent warnings to territorial leaders throughout the region, she couldn't shake the feeling that their enemies had anticipated this moment. The attacks were too well coordinated, too precisely timed to be simple opportunism. Someone had been planning this for months, maybe years. Someone who understood not just the political landscape, but the supernatural forces that were stirring in response to her awakening. Someone who knew exactly how she and Theron would respond to threats against innocent lives. The mate bond that connected them was their greatest strength, a source of power and mutual support that made them more formidable together than either could be alone. But it was also their greatest vulnerability, a connection that enemies could exploit if they understood how to manipulate the protective instincts that drove both of them. "The warnings are sent," she said, stepping back from the crystals as confirmation signals began arriving from distant territories. "They'll have hours to prepare, maybe enough time to save most of the civilian populations." "And us?" Theron asked, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her heart race. "How do we prepare for what's coming?" Kyra looked out the window at the ancient Guardian, still pacing with predatory grace as it sensed the approaching storm. Beyond the palace walls, she could feel the wild creatures of her bloodline gathering in response to her unconscious call. Bears emerging from winter dens, wolves abandoning their territories, birds of prey circling overhead like a living storm cloud. "We remember what we are," she said, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had carried her through 23 years of believing she was nothing. "I am the Silver Moon Queen, heir to powers older than the political structures our enemies seek to destroy. You are the Alpha King, defender of the innocent and guardian of the ancient covenants. Together, we are something they cannot defeat through conventional warfare." The mate bond pulsed between them, silver fire that burned brighter as they acknowledged the truth of what they had become together. Not just lovers or political allies, but two halves of something greater, a partnership that had the potential to reshape the balance between civilization and the wild magic that pulsed at the heart of all things. But as the sun set over the palace courtyard, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Kira couldn't escape the feeling that the real test of their bond was still ahead of them. The enemies who had murdered her parents, who had spent 23 years believing the Silver Moon bloodline was safely extinct, would throw everything they had at stopping her from claiming her full power. And when the battle came, when the choice between personal love and political necessity reached its breaking point, she would finally discover whether the mate bond was strong enough to survive the weight of a crown that commanded the loyalty of legends. Chapter 9. Ancient Prophecy Fulfilled. The attack came at midnight, when the moon was dark and the ancient powers that protected the palace were at their weakest ebb. Kira woke to the sound of the ancient guardian's roar, a sound that shook the very foundations of the Silver Moon Palace and sent every wild creature within miles into defensive fury. Through the mate bond, she felt Theron's instant alertness as he responded to the same supernatural warning. He was in the eastern tower, coordinating defences with his personal guard, but she could sense his desperate need to reach her side as the magnitude of the threat became clear. This was not the coordinated strike they had prepared for. This was something far worse. "My queen!" Elder Miriam's voice came from the doorway, the ancient woman moving with speed that defied her age. "You must come quickly. The attackers, they're not using conventional weapons. They're wielding magic that predates the pack hierarchies, power that was buried for good reason." Kira threw on her battle robes, silver silk embroidered with protective runes that pulsed with their own inner light. The pendant at her throat blazed like a captured star, responding to the dark magic that pressed against the palace wards like poison seeking a wound. What kind of magic, she asked, though part of her already knew the answer from the way her bloodline was responding with instinctive revulsion. "Shadow magic," Miriam said, her weathered face creased with fear and ancient memory. "The forbidden arts that your ancestors helped seal away centuries ago. Someone has been studying the old texts, learning to wield power that was meant to stay buried." As they hurried through the palace corridors toward the main hall, Kira could feel the corrupted magic pressing against her supernatural senses, like acid against exposed nerves. It was wrong, fundamentally twisted in ways that made her silver wolf recoil with disgust. This wasn't the natural magic of her bloodline, or even the dark but honest power of traditional combat magic. This was something that had been perverted, turned against its own nature in pursuit of destruction for its own sake. They reached the main hall to find chaos erupting on all sides. Through the great windows she could see shapes moving in the darkness beyond the palace walls. Not just human attackers, but creatures of shadow and nightmare that should not have been able to exist in the natural world. The palace guards were fighting valiantly, but conventional weapons seemed to pass through the shadow creatures without effect. The ancient guardian stood in the centre of the hall, its massive form blazing with silver fire as it battled something that hurt to look at directly. A creature of pure darkness, tentacles of shadow writhing where limbs should be, eyes like burning coals that left after images of pain across her vision. "A shadow wraith," Miriam breathed, her voice thick with horror. "They've summoned actual shadow wraiths. The last time those creatures walked the mortal realm, half the northern territories burned before they were banished." Through the mate bond, Kira felt Theron approaching at desperate speed, but she also sensed his frustration as his own forces encountered similar shadow creatures throughout the palace. Conventional military tactics were useless against enemies that existed partially outside reality itself. But as she watched the Guardian battle the Wraith with increasing desperation, as she felt the dark magic pressing closer to the palace's inner sanctums, something stirred in her memory. Not her own memory, but something deeper, ancestral knowledge passed down through bloodline connections that transcended individual lifetimes. "The prophecy," she whispered, understanding flooding through her like silver fire. This is what it was warning about, not just the return of the Silver Moon bloodline, but the return of the shadow magic that we were created to oppose. Miriam's eyes widened with recognition and hope. "You remember. The ancient texts, the original purpose of your bloodline. Your ancestors weren't just queens, they were guardians against the darkness that seeks to devour the natural order." The pendant at Kira's throat pulsed brighter, and she could feel power flowing through it that connected her not just to the Guardian, but to something far older. The original covenant between the Silver Moon bloodline and the forces of natural magic, the binding that had kept shadow creatures banished from the mortal realm for over 1,000 years. But that covenant required more than just her power. It required the willing partnership of her mate, the joining of two ancient bloodlines in common purpose. As if summoned by her realization, Theron burst through the hall's main doors, his sword gleaming with the silver fire that marked weapons blessed by legitimate authority. Behind him came his personal guard, but they stopped short when they saw the shadow wraith battling the Guardian in the hall's centre. "Conventional weapons are useless," he said, moving to Kira's side with the fluid grace of a warrior who had never known defeat. "But I can feel something through our bond, power that responds to both of us together." "The prophecy speaks of two bloodlines united," Kira said, her voice carrying the certainty of ancestral memory finally awakened. "The Silver Moon Queens who command the natural magic, and the Alpha Kings who wield the authority to bind supernatural forces. Together we can restore the banishment that keeps the Shadow Realm separate from our world." The mate bond between them flared brighter as they acknowledged the truth of their shared destiny. This wasn't just about political alliance or personal love. It was about fulfilling a purpose that had been written into their very souls before either of them was born. "Tell me what to do," Theron said, his dark eyes holding absolute trust as he prepared to follow her lead into power older than recorded history. Kira reached for his hand, and the moment their skin touched, silver fire erupted around them both. The pendant at her throat blazed bright enough to illuminate the entire hall, and she could feel the ancient words of binding rising from depths of knowledge she hadn't known she possessed. "By silver light and royal authority," she began, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated in dimensions beyond normal hearing. "By mate bond and ancient covenant, by the power that flows through bloodlines blessed by the first magic, we call upon the forces that maintain the boundary between light and shadow." Theron's voice joined hers, his words carrying the weight of kingly authority that had commanded respect for generations. "By the strength of the pack, by the loyalty of those who serve justice, by the bond that connects us to powers older than civilization, we renew the banishment that keeps corruption from poisoning the natural world." The shadow wraith battling the Guardian let out a shriek that seemed to tear reality itself, its form becoming less solid as the ancient binding reasserted its hold. Around the palace, other shadow creatures began dissolving like nightmares exposed to daylight, their artificial existence unable to maintain itself against the renewed covenant. But the magic came at a cost. Kira felt power flowing out of her like blood from an opened vein, the effort of renewing bindings that had been weakened by centuries of neglect, demanding more strength than she had known she possessed. Through the mate bond, she felt Theron's own energy being drawn into the working, his royal authority adding weight to words that required both their bloodlines to achieve full effect. As the last of the shadow creatures dissolved into nothingness, as the corrupted magic that had poisoned the night air finally dissipated, they collapsed together onto the hall's stone floor. The ancient guardian padded over to them, its massive form radiating approval and protective warmth as it settled beside its exhausted queen. "The prophecy is fulfilled," Miriam said, her voice thick with wonder and relief. "The shadow magic is banished, the ancient covenant renewed. The Silver Moon bloodline and the Alpha King's authority joined in common purpose, as it was always meant to be." Through the mate bond, Kira felt Theron's fierce satisfaction and unshakable love. They had faced the ultimate test of their partnership and emerged stronger, their connection elevated from personal devotion to legendary purpose. "The territories will have to recognize this," he said, his voice hoarse from the magical working, but carrying quiet certainty. "We've just saved the entire region from shadow magic that would have consumed everything in its path. Political opposition means nothing in the face of that kind of service." Kira nodded, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones, like recognition finally being spoken aloud. She was no longer just the servant girl who had discovered royal blood, no longer just the queen struggling to claim her rightful throne. She was the Silver Moon guardian who had renewed the ancient protections, who had fulfilled prophecy and bound her bloodline to its original sacred purpose. And beside her, Theron was no longer just the Alpha King who had chosen personal love over political convenience. He was her partner in power, her equal in authority, her mate in the deepest sense that transcended both politics and passion. Together, they had become something greater than either could be alone. Together, they had proven that some bonds were strong enough to reshape the world itself. But as they helped each other to their feet, as the palace guards began securing the area and tending to the wounded, Kira couldn't shake the feeling that this victory had only been the beginning. The shadow magic had been banished, but those who had summoned it remained free. And now that they knew the full extent of her power, now that they understood the prophecy she was destined to fulfill, they would not simply retreat into hiding. The real war was just beginning. But for the first time since her awakening, she faced it not as a frightened girl discovering her heritage, but as a queen who had claimed her full power and a mate bond that had been blessed by forces older than time itself.